What if every word you've ever trusted never had a fixed meaning to begin with? Not truth, not justice, not even identity. Jacques Derrida built his entire philosophy around this unsettling idea, showing that language doesn't give us certainty. It quietly keeps shifting beneath our feet. And once you start seeing it, you can't unsee it. The way you read, think, and understand the world begins to change completely. Jacques Derrida was born in 1930 in El Bayer, a suburb of Algiers in French Algeria, into a Jewish family living under colonial rule. His early life unfolded in a world shaped by overlapping identities and tensions. Algeria at the time was not an independent nation, but a colony of France, and this meant that cultural, political, and social life was deeply divided. French institutions dominated public life, yet many communities existed on the margins of that system. Growing up within this environment exposed him from an early age to questions about belonging, exclusion, and the instability of identity. His childhood was marked by a particularly formative experience during the Second World War. When the Vichy regime came to power in France, anti-Jewish laws were enforced across French territories, including Algeria. As a result, he was expelled from school simply because of his identity. This sudden exclusion left a lasting impression. The idea that a system could define who belongs and who does not, who is accepted and who is rejected, became something he would never forget. These early experiences planted the seeds for the intellectual direction his life would later take. Rather than accepting social structures as natural or fixed, he would spend much of his career examining how systems of thought create boundaries and distinctions that shape human understanding. After the war, he continued his education and eventually moved to France to study in Paris. There he entered one of the most demanding academic environments in the country, the École Normale Supérieure. Paris during this period was alive with intellectual energy. Philosophers were debating existentialism, structuralism, language, and the nature of meaning. The atmosphere encouraged students to challenge established ideas and explore new ways of thinking. At the university, he immersed himself in philosophy, reading widely across both classical and modern thinkers. He studied the works of Plato, Aristotle, Kant, and Hegel, as well as more recent philosophers who were re-examining language and meaning. One of the dominant intellectual movements of the time was structuralism, which attempted to understand human culture by identifying underlying structures that shape language, thought, and society. Structuralist thinkers believed that systems such as language operate according to rules that determine how meaning is produced. Words do not have meaning by themselves, but gain significance through their relationships with other words within a system. This approach provided powerful tools for analyzing language, literature, and culture. While he was influenced by these ideas, he also began to notice something that would become central to his own philosophy. Structuralism often treated systems as stable and coherent, as if meaning could ultimately be fixed by understanding the underlying structure. But he suspected that meaning might be far less stable than these theories suggested. This suspicion led him to examine language more closely. Words appear to carry meaning, yet when one attempts to define a word precisely, it often leads to other words, which in turn require further explanation. Meaning seems to be constantly deferred, never fully captured in a single definition. Language does not provide a final, stable foundation for meaning, but instead creates an ongoing chain of references. From this insight, he began developing one of the most influential and controversial approaches in modern philosophy. Rather than try to build a system that explains meaning once and for all, he explored how meaning is always shifting, always dependent on context, and never fully fixed. This approach came to be known as deconstruction. The term did not refer to destroying ideas, but to carefully analyzing texts and concepts in order to reveal hidden assumptions and internal tensions. Philosophical arguments often appear stable and consistent on the surface, yet closer examination can reveal contradictions or unresolved complexities within them. For example, many philosophical traditions rely on clear distinctions such as presence and absence, speech and writing, truth and error. These oppositions are often treated as if one side is more fundamental or more important than the other. But he argued that these hierarchies are not as stable as they appear. Each concept depends on its opposite in order to have meaning. Speech, for instance, is often considered more immediate and authentic than writing. Yet both forms rely on systems of language that operate through differences between signs. The distinction between them is not as simple or natural as it might seem. By examining such oppositions carefully, he showed that the boundaries separating concepts are often more fragile than philosophers have assumed. This method of analysis challenged long-standing assumptions about language, meaning, and truth. Instead of searching for fixed foundations, he emphasized the complexity and instability of interpretation. Texts do not contain a single definitive meaning waiting to be discovered. Instead, meaning emerges through the interaction between language, context, and the reader. These ideas quickly attracted attention and sparked intense debate. Some thinkers found his work liberating because it opened new ways of interpreting literature, philosophy, and culture. Others criticized it for undermining the possibility of stable meaning or objective truth. Yet regardless of these debates, his work forced scholars to reconsider the nature of language itself. The assumption that words simply reflect reality became increasingly difficult to maintain. Instead, language appeared as a dynamic system in which meaning is always in motion, shaped by differences, contexts, and interpretations. As his thinking developed further in the intellectual atmosphere of Paris, he began engaging more directly with the dominant philosophical movements of his time. Structuralism, which had gained significant influence during the mid-20th century, attempted to uncover the underlying systems that organize language, culture, and human thought. According to this view, meaning is not created individually, but emerges from the structure of relationships within a system. Words gain significance not because they point directly to things in the world, but because they differ from other words within a network of signs. While he appreciated the precision and ambition of this approach, he also began to see its limitations. Structuralism often treated these systems as stable and self-contained, as if once the structure was identified, meaning could be fully explained. But the more closely he examined language, the more he became convinced that something essential was being overlooked. The structures themselves were not as fixed or reliable as they appeared. He began focusing on a simple yet unsettling observation. Whenever we attempt to define a word, we rely on other words to explain it. Each definition leads to another, and that leads to another, creating an endless chain of references. Meaning never arrives as a final, complete presence. Instead, it is constantly deferred, always pointing beyond itself to something else. This insight became one of the central ideas in his work. To describe this process, he introduced a concept that suggested both difference and deferral at the same time. Meaning arises through differences between words, but it is also delayed, never fully present in any single expression. Language, in this sense, is not a stable system delivering clear meanings, but a dynamic process in which meaning is always shifting and unfolding. This realization had profound consequences for philosophy. For centuries, many philosophers had searched for firm foundations of truth. They believed that beneath the complexity of language, there must exist stable concepts that could ground knowledge with certainty. But his work suggested that such stability might be an illusion created by the way language is used. He began examining philosophical texts with a new kind of attention. Rather than accepting their arguments at face value, he looked for moments where the text seemed to contradict itself or rely on assumptions it could not fully justify. These tensions were not simply mistakes. They revealed something deeper about the nature of language and thought. This method, which came to be known as deconstruction, did not aim to destroy meaning or dismiss philosophical work. Instead, it sought to show that texts are more complex than they appear. Beneath their surface coherence, there are often competing ideas and unresolved tensions that shape how meaning is produced. One of the key targets of his analysis was the long tradition in Western philosophy that privileged certain concepts over others. For example, Philosophers had often treated speech as more authentic than writing. Speech was seen as a direct expression of thought, while writing was considered a secondary representation, something less immediate and less reliable. He challenged this hierarchy by showing that both speech and writing depend on systems of signs that function through difference. Even when we speak, our words gain meaning only because they differ from other possible words. There is no pure, direct access to meaning that exists outside of language. The idea that speech provides a more immediate connection to truth begins to lose its certainty when examined closely. By questioning these traditional hierarchies, he revealed how deeply philosophical thinking depends on oppositions such as presence and absence, truth and error, original and copy. These oppositions are often treated as stable foundations, yet his work showed that each side depends on the other in order to have meaning. The boundaries separating them are not fixed but constantly shifting. During the 1960s, his work began gaining significant attention, particularly after a series of lectures and publications that introduced his ideas to a wider audience. One important moment came when he presented his work at a major academic conference in the United States. The event brought together leading thinkers who were exploring structuralism and related fields. His presentation challenged many of the assumptions that had been guiding these discussions. The response was immediate and intense. Some scholars were fascinated by the way his ideas opened new possibilities for interpreting texts and questioning established theories. Others were deeply critical, arguing that his approach undermined the possibility of clear meaning and objective knowledge. Debates about his work quickly spread across universities in Europe and America. Despite the controversy, his influence continued to grow. Literary critics found his methods particularly valuable for analyzing complex texts. By examining how language operates within literature, they could uncover multiple layers of meaning that might otherwise remain hidden. Philosophers also engaged with his work, either developing his ideas further or attempting to challenge them. What made his work especially powerful was not simply the conclusions he reached, but the way he approached reading itself. He encouraged readers to pay attention to details that are often overlooked. Small shifts in language, subtle contradictions, or unexpected word choices can reveal important insights about how a text functions. This careful attention to language also had broader implications beyond philosophy and literature. If meaning is always shaped by context and difference, then communication itself becomes a more complex process than it first appears. There is no simple transfer of fixed meaning from one person to another. Instead, meaning emerges through interpretation, shaped by the interaction between language, context, and the reader. At the same time, he did not claim that meaning is completely arbitrary or that interpretation has no limits. Language still operates within structures and conventions that guide understanding. But these structures are never completely stable or closed. There's always room for reinterpretation, for new meanings to emerge from the same text. As his work continued developing, he remained deeply engaged with other philosophical traditions while also challenging them. He read widely across literature, philosophy, and linguistics, drawing connections between different fields. His writing style itself reflected the complexity of his ideas. Rather than presenting simple arguments, he often explored multiple possibilities within a single text, allowing meanings to unfold gradually. By the end of this period, his position within the intellectual world had become firmly established. He was recognized as one of the most original and provocative thinkers of his time. His work had not only challenged structuralism, but had also reshaped how scholars approach language, meaning, and interpretation itself. As his influence expanded across Europe and the United States, his work began reshaping not only philosophy, but also fields far beyond it. Literary theory, cultural studies, law, and even architecture started engaging with his ideas about language and meaning. What made his work so powerful was not that it offered a simple new theory to replace older ones, but that it changed how people approached interpretation itself. Reading was no longer seen as the passive act of uncovering a fixed meaning hidden inside a text. Instead, it became an active process shaped by language, context, and the assumptions brought by the reader. This shift was particularly significant in literature. Critics began applying his method to novels, poems, and philosophical texts, examining how language operates within them. Instead of searching for a single correct interpretation, they explored how texts produce multiple meanings, often containing internal tensions that cannot be fully resolved. A passage that appears straightforward at first might reveal contradictions when examined more closely. These contradictions were not flaws to be corrected, but clues to the deeper complexity of language. His work encouraged readers to notice what texts leave unsaid as much as what they explicitly state. Silences, omissions, and assumptions became just as important as direct arguments. A philosophical work might claim to establish a clear distinction between two ideas, yet rely on hidden assumptions that blur that very distinction. By carefully tracing these moments, he showed that texts often undermine their own claims in subtle ways. At the same time, his ideas began influencing debates about law and justice. Legal systems rely heavily on language, interpreting written laws and applying them to specific situations. If meaning is not fixed and always depends on context, then legal interpretation becomes a far more complex process than simply applying rules. Some legal scholars used his work to argue that justice requires constant reinterpretation rather than strict adherence to rigid definitions. Laws must be read and understood within changing social contexts, and no interpretation can claim absolute finality. In the United States, his lectures attracted large audiences, and universities became important centers for the spread of his ideas. Students and scholars engaged deeply with his work, sometimes embracing it enthusiastically, sometimes criticizing it sharply. The debates surrounding his philosophy were often intense because they touched on fundamental questions about truth, meaning, and interpretation. Critics frequently argued that his work led to a kind of intellectual uncertainty. If meaning is always shifting and never fully stable, does that mean anything can be interpreted in any way? Does this approach undermine the possibility of truth itself? These criticisms became especially strong in academic discussions, where some worried that the emphasis on instability could weaken the foundations of knowledge. Yet his position was more subtle than these criticisms suggested. He did not argue that meaning does not exist or that interpretation is completely arbitrary. Instead, he showed that meaning is always shaped by context and cannot be reduced to a single final explanation. Language provides structure and limits, but it also allows for variation and reinterpretation. The challenge is not to abandon meaning, but to recognize its complexity. Another important aspect of his work involved the idea of presence, which had been central to much of Western philosophy. Many philosophical traditions assumed that truth could be fully present, directly accessible, and clearly expressed through language. He questioned this assumption by showing that language always involves absence as well as presence. Words point to things that are not fully contained within them. Meaning depends on what is not immediately present as much as on what is. This insight had far-reaching implications. It suggested that human understanding is always incomplete, always shaped by what lies beyond immediate perception. Rather than achieving perfect clarity, thinking involves navigating a space where meanings are constantly shifting and evolving. As his reputation grew, he continued engaging with a wide range of thinkers, both past and present. He wrote extensively on philosophers such as Plato, Rousseau, and Heidegger, as well as on literary figures. These readings were not simple commentaries, but complex interpretations that revealed new dimensions within familiar texts. By applying his method to the history of philosophy itself, he showed that even the most established ideas contain tensions and ambiguities that can be explored further. His writing style often reflected the complexity of his ideas. Instead of presenting straightforward arguments, his texts sometimes moved in unexpected directions, exploring multiple possibilities within a single discussion. This made his work challenging to read, but also deeply engaging for those willing to follow his careful analysis of language. Despite the difficulty of his writing, his influence continued expanding. Younger generations of scholars began incorporating his ideas into new areas of research, applying his approach to questions about culture, identity, politics, and media. His work encouraged people to question assumptions that have long been taken for granted, opening new ways of thinking about how meaning is created and understood. Through these developments, he became one of the central figures in what came to be known as post-structuralist thought. This movement did not reject structure entirely, but emphasized that structures are never completely stable or fixed. Language, culture, and meaning are always in motion, shaped by differences that prevent final closure. By this stage of his career, his impact on intellectual life was unmistakable. He had not only challenged existing theories, but had also transformed the way scholars approach texts, language, and interpretation itself. The idea that meaning is always open to reinterpretation became one of the defining insights of late 20th century thought, influencing discussions across many different disciplines. As his later years unfolded, his position within the intellectual world became both firmly established and continuously debated. By this stage, his work had already influenced an entire generation of thinkers, yet it remained a source of tension and disagreement within universities. Some regarded him as one of the most important philosophers of the modern era, while others remained skeptical of his approach, questioning whether his ideas made philosophy more insightful or more uncertain. This mixture of admiration and criticism followed him throughout the final decades of his life. What continued to distinguish him was the consistency with which he returned to the question of language. While many philosophers focused on building systems or defending clear positions, he remained committed to examining how meaning is formed, deferred, and reshaped through interpretation. Rather than offering final answers, he exposed the processes through which answers are constructed. This made his work feel less like a set of conclusions and more like an ongoing investigation into how thinking itself operates. During these years, he also began addressing ethical and political questions more directly. Earlier in his career, his work had often been interpreted as primarily concerned with language and texts. But over time, he explored how his ideas could apply to issues such as justice, responsibility, and decision-making. If meaning is never fully fixed, then ethical decisions cannot rely on simple rules applied mechanically. Each situation requires careful interpretation, and every decision carries a degree of uncertainty. He introduced the idea that responsibility becomes more meaningful precisely because certainty is never complete. If moral decisions could be made through fixed formulas, there would be little room for genuine responsibility. But because situations are complex and meanings are never fully stable, individuals must make choices without absolute guarantees. Responsibility, in this sense, involves acting within uncertainty while remaining aware of the limits of one's knowledge. This perspective also shaped his reflections on justice. Laws are written in language, and as he had shown, language always allows for interpretation. This means that justice cannot be reduced to simply applying legal rules in a mechanical way. Each case requires interpretation, and that interpretation must remain open to revision. Justice, therefore, is not something that can be fully achieved once and for all. It is something that must be continually pursued. These ideas resonated strongly with scholars in fields such as law and political theory, where questions about interpretation and authority are central. His work encouraged a more reflective approach to these issues, emphasizing the importance of examining how language shapes decisions and how assumptions influence judgments. At the same time, he continued engaging with literature, philosophy, and cultural analysis, producing writings that explored a wide range of topics. His work often moved across boundaries between disciplines, connecting philosophy with literature, history, and even architecture. This interdisciplinary approach allowed him to reach audiences beyond traditional philosophy departments, further expanding his influence. Despite his growing international recognition, he maintained a certain distance from conventional academic expectations. His writing remained complex and demanding, often resisting easy summaries or simplified explanations. This difficulty was not accidental. It reflected his belief that language itself is complex and that philosophical thinking must engage with that complexity rather than reducing it to simple formulas. In the later stages of his life, he continued traveling, lecturing, and participating in intellectual debates around the world. Universities in Europe and the United States frequently invited him to speak, and his lectures attracted large audiences. These events were not simply formal presentations, but opportunities for ongoing dialogue about the nature of language, meaning, and interpretation. As the 20th century approached its end, his influence could be seen across a wide range of fields. Literary criticism had been transformed by his approach to reading texts. Legal theory had been reshaped by his emphasis on interpretation. Cultural studies had adopted his methods for analyzing language and power. Even discussions about media and communication began reflecting his insights into how meaning is constructed and contested. Jacques Derrida died in 2004 at the age of 74. By the time of his death, he had become one of the most widely discussed and debated thinkers in contemporary philosophy. His work had challenged deeply rooted assumptions about language, truth, and meaning, leaving behind a legacy that continues to shape intellectual life. What makes his contribution especially significant is not that he replaced one philosophical system with another, but that he changed how philosophy itself is practiced. Instead of seeking final certainty, his work encourages careful attention to the processes through which meaning is created. It invites readers to question what appears obvious, to examine the assumptions hidden within language, and to remain open to multiple interpretations. His ideas leave behind a lasting challenge. If meaning is always shaped by context and never fully fixed, then understanding requires patience, attention, and a willingness to question one's own assumptions. Language does not simply reflect reality. It actively participates in shaping how reality is understood. The intellectual journey that began in a colonial suburb of Algiers eventually transformed how scholars across the world think about texts, language, and interpretation. By revealing the instability hidden within seemingly stable ideas, he opened a space for new ways of thinking, where certainty gives way to inquiry and fixed meaning gives way to ongoing exploration. In this way, his work continues to influence not only philosophy, but also the broader human effort to understand how meaning itself comes into being.